Yes, hello to the third Lindo webinar. My name is Christoph Schumacher. I'm the Lindau Alumni and Community Manager, and I warmly welcome you to our webinar from Lindau. Today's topic is communicating with the media, how to tell your story as a scientist. Our presenter, Alaina Levine, will just take over in a few minutes. But first, I would like to bring your attention to a couple of things here from Lindau. One of the elements is most of you probably already heard of it or joined, but we have an online community now specifically for Lindo alumni, the Lindo Alumni Network. It's the digital space for Lindo spirit, and we have really upgraded it in the last couple of months, and it's now a great tool where you can connect to others through a search. You can also share your works, share projects you're involved with, exchange stories, of course, and also it's the first space where you can find out about Lindau alumni events like this webinar or like a workshop we had recently, or also any events that are coming up in 2019. All alumni of the last couple of years already have an account, and everyone else can just sign in at Lindau-alumni-network.org, and then I will create your account pretty quickly. Then there are two things I would like to introduce today. Today we actually published a Nature Outlook that was partly produced during this year's meeting, and that we produced with Nature and Mars Incorporated. The topic is Science Without Borders. It's all about different themes on the topic of empowering scientists and researchers in developing economies. And there's a really nice article in it. A couple of Lindau alumni actually got involved with on the development of science in Africa. So check that out. I posted the link in the Lindau Alumni Network, and you can also find it on our social media channels. And then another thing I would like to mention is that we're looking for Lindau alumni reviewers. Last year, we introduced poster sessions and, of course, the master classes to the meeting. And this year, for the first time, we had Lindau alumni who were involved in the selection process for the master class and poster sessions. Only a couple of young scientists are selected to present their paper, present the work in that form. And we had a really good group of Lindau alumni who helped us pre-select those applicants, review the abstracts, and we're doing that probably again this year for the physics meeting. So if there are physicists among you who would like to volunteer as a reviewer for the poster sessions and master classes, just write me an email. We'll probably put out more information on that in November and then leading up to the meeting. And without further much ado, I would like to hand over to a presenter today, Alaina Levine. She's a science writer and career consultant. She's worked with us before, already hosted 2 webinars for us. She's the president of Quantum Success Solutions and wrote a book in 2015 called Networking for Nerds, which already gives you a bit of an introduction to her. She also attended the last couple of Lindo meetings as a panelist and as a moderator, as a journalist. And now I'm really excited about the webinar today and what she has to say about communicating with the public.
Thank you so
Alaina,
much,
please.
Chris. Thank you, Christoph. Thank you so much. And I want to extend my appreciation to the Lindau Nobel Laureates Meetings, the Council and the Foundation, who have been so gracious in their support of this endeavor, these webinars, in support of you, my fellow Lindau nerds in the audience, the Lindau alumni who are really going out there. You are going out there and changing the world every single day. I can't imagine the amazing solutions you will come up with for humanity's grand challenges in the future. That's your promise. That's your expectation. I'm excited for you. So we're going to talk about how to get the word out for all the amazing things that you're doing with the press, to work with the media, to make sure that it's clear to the media and then ultimately to their audiences, which truly are your audiences, what you're doing, the impact you're having, why people should be investing in science and engineering and technology and mathematics, why people should care about science and engineering and mathematics and technology. And all these things are absolutely critically important, and they're critically woven into the whole structure of media relations. And a lot of scientists, and honestly, quite frankly, professionals in other fields too, beyond STEM, think, well, I don't have to be involved in media relations because the media relations people, the public relations professionals, the public information officers at their institutions, that's their job. My job is to do science. Their job is to communicate with the public and also with the media. And what I would argue is that as scientists and engineers, as the value creators of society, as the people who are going to provide humanity's solutions to humanity's grand challenges, it's absolutely vital for you to make sure that you are communicating in a way that the press, the journalists, the reporters understand the value of what you're doing so that they can communicate that to the audiences. And of course, the audiences, the readers, the viewers, those are the people who make decisions and who influence the people who make decisions about the funding that you get, about the laws that support scientific research and the laws that are informed from scientific research and engineering innovation. So it's not a side issue of interacting with the media as a scientist. It's actually woven in through your whole profession. So I want you to start thinking about that. And the more you do it and the easier, the sooner you start thinking with that mindset of, I want to partner with the press as early as I possibly can in my career. And by the way, it's never too late. I don't care if you've been a scientist for 20, 30, or 40 years or more. It's never too late to partner with the press. Once you start adopting that, you actually make opportunities for yourself, you advance the field, you advance opportunities for your colleagues, and ultimately for science itself. So you are contributing to finding those solutions by interacting, communicating, and partnering with the press. And that's why we're having this webinar today. So now, before we get started, I just want to say that you are absolutely welcome, as usual, to live tweet this talk. You can take photographs of the slides that we're presenting, as well as tweet anything that I say. And all we ask is that if you are going to tweet, that you use the handle for the Lindau Alumni, excuse me, the Lindau Nobel Laureate Meetings at Lindau Nobel, and my handle at Alaina Levine. And I thought maybe it'd be kind of fun today, because we're all alumni here. When you tweet, why not tweet with a hashtag of the year that you went to Lindau? So if you went in 2012, hashtag Lino12. If you went in 1967, hashtag Lino67. Let's just do that. Let's tweet and see where we're all coming from and what years we're representing for the Lindau Nobel Laureate Meetings. I think it'd be really interesting to see the entire diversity and the many, many people that are joining us on this webinar today, what years you went to Lindau and what it did to change your life. So let's get into this. Let's talk about how you get press and how you work with the press and how you keep those precious press partnerships going, growing, and flowing. So we're going to talk about how we can understand and identify and really clarify the media landscape, and how to work with your public relations or public information officer, PIO, departments within the institution that you happen to work for at the moment. And I want to give you some very specific tips for effectively communicating with the media, and then ideas for networking with reporters and editors. And then, of course, we can't talk about press without talking about social media. It's integral to both those areas. Social media and media relations are connected now, and so very much so. And so we have to talk about how to utilize social media in an effective manner to make sure that we are creating those partnerships and getting the word out about our work. Okay, so let's talk about understanding the media. And, I just want to say, before I even go into that, I want to give you a little bit of background about myself. So Christoph mentioned that I'm a journalist. And so today, as with my own business, I am a freelance science journalist. I do other science writing too, but one of the areas that I focus on is science journalism. So I write for different magazines, and I've written for Science and Nature and Scientific American and Smithsonian and others. And I've written about, in a journalistic way, I've written about scientific discoveries, engineering innovations, profiles of scientists and engineers and unusual careers. And I've also written about issues, associated trends, and hot topics associated with science and hiring of scientists and engineers and science policy and things of that nature. So as a journalist, I'm presenting this workshop to you today as a journalist, but I have also worked as a communications director. So my very first job after I graduated from university was working for the University of Arizona Physics Department as the director of communications. So that was a good deal of that was media relations. And I was in media relations and public relations for the U of A in the physics department and later on with the College of Science for a total of 13 years. And so I have a lot of experience working in from both sides of the situation, from the journalism side and looking for stories and writing stories and working with public relations professionals and working with scientists to write stories about them. And I also have experience on the other side working with journalists, working with scientists, trying to pitch journalists to cover stories that were focused on things that I was representing as a public relations professional. And I did this also for other organizations that I worked for as well, both in a pro bono capacity, so working as a volunteer, and then also working as a consultant and as a freelance public relations strategist. So I wanted you to understand that I see it from both directions as we're going forward. And of course, I'm a nerd too. So, my background's mathematics and physics, my degree's in mathematics. So I also have that perspective as well. So when we're talking about the media and how we as the media, the journalists, how we work, I just wanted to give you some sort of definitions and sort of the way you think about this. So first of all, when we're talking about the quote unquote media, what I'm referring to are reporters and journalists. So the people who are actually writing or producing the content that tells your story as a scientist. And they can include journalists who are, their medium is completely just written. And most of what I do is written work. But then there are also multimedia journalists that are doing all sorts of different things with data science in particular. There's digital journalists who are trying to specifically incorporate data science and build data science into stories and build stories out of the data that is coming through the pike. And then there are also multimedia journalists that are incorporating videos and photographs and interactive digital products online so that you really have a high level of engagement with the reader or with the audience. And of course, there's photojournalists too. So these are some of the different types of media that you may be interacting with in the course of your career. And our medium, okay, where we're actually producing this work is going to be in printed publications like Science, like Nature, like National Geographic, but it's also going to be in online publications, right? And as you know, most magazines have an online presence. In fact, I think 100% of magazines have an online presence now. And so, to be quite frank, many of the articles that I write for printed publications are also produced online. And sometimes, this is really interesting, sometimes a shorter version appears in the printed magazine, but a longer version of the same story appears on the online page of the magazine. So it's just something for you to keep in mind about. And we also produce this content via multimedia outputs. So I could be writing captions for photographs. I could be writing scripts for videos, for podcasts, things of that nature. And then, of course, there's blogs, which are not necessarily in the quote unquote mainstream media, but are online and produced by anybody, including yourself. So as a journalist, what do I need? What do I need from you? I need stories. I need stories, stories, stories. And that's the key word. I don't just need to know that you published a paper. I don't just need to know that we, as our company, just launched a new widget. That is not a story. That's just a thing. What I need is the story around it. So I need a new story, a new angle, a new innovation, a new perspective, something new for my audience about the work that you do. We're going to talk more about that in a bit. But the key about the story is that it is related to people. So ideally, most of my audience are humans. And so I'm thinking about what do they want to hear about? They want to hear stories, and they are stories. They want to hear stories and read stories about people that they can relate to. okay, not necessarily products. I can't relate to a product. Now, there's always a human element to the development of a product, and we're going to talk more about that too. But ideally, it's about people, and I will give you examples of this. So this is the key: is what are the stories that you can give me about people? That's key. Now, when you are working with your public relations and your PIO, again, that stands for Public Information Officers. That's the typical phrase that we hear in academic institutions, so PIOs. And a PIO, it really is just a public relations professional, but they do a lot of different things. And honestly, in your institution, they may have another title. So for example, at the University of Arizona, where I worked for many years and still stay in contact, I've noticed that the department that handles external relations has people their titles are science writers, but they're essentially PIOs. They've also had people who are called, their title is PIOs. They've had people whose titles are Director of Communications or Director of Media Relations or Director of Public Relations. It honestly just depends on who's running that division at the moment. But all of these people that you see on the screen in front of you, these are all the people, and whether they use this title or another title, these are the people that are on your team. And make no mistake, when you have a public relations professional or a PIO in your institution that you work for, you both work for the same institution, you're on the same team. They are not out to get you. They're actually out to help you. They're out to help you get press. They're out to help you disseminate the information about the work that you do, the value of the work that you do. So you and them are on the same team, and it's really vitally important to build a relationship with them so that they see that you are in it for the win-win. But what exactly do they do? Let's talk about that. What do they do? So PR pros and PIOs, first and foremost, they serve as a liaison between the media and the source. So the source, when I use that phrase here, the source, that word, in this webinar, what I mean by that is the person who is being interviewed for the article. So for example, I recently wrote an article, and I'm going to reference this later on as another example. I recently wrote an article that's going to be published in a magazine about careers in artificial intelligence, scientific research careers in artificial intelligence. And for that article, I had to interview a number of different sources. So the source is simply just the professor, the researcher, the scientist or the engineer who is working in that area. So they're the person who provides me with the background information. They're the person who provides me with quotes. They're the person who I interview who helps me understand the lay of the land and helps me to understand what the essence of the story is. So you, in this case, in this equation, you are the source. So that's what I was saying earlier when I said that you're in partnership with the PIOs in your institution. You're going to be a source for me as a journalist. So you and them are in partnership. You and the PIO are in partnership, and they are helping you to liaise with me, the journalists. And the PIOs also help to build those relationships with the media, and they really try to encourage us, the journalists, to cover institutional stories. So the really talented PIOs that I interact with are the ones who are on a regular basis checking in with me. They're checking in with me to see what kinds of stories I might be interested in writing about in the future, what types of publications I am still writing for, and what types of publications I might consider pitching in the future. They are sending me resources to help me to think about stories. They're keeping me in mind when there's an opportunity to assist me. They are letting me know that they are there as a resource. And then they're also pitching me stories as well. So this is really the kernel of the relationship that they're building. And the idea is that as they invest in this relationship, the more they invest in it, the more opportunity there's going to be for me, the journalist, and the more encouragement I'm going to have for me as the journalist to write about institutional stories that are coming from sources like you. So related to that, they are also developing very specific strategic plans for their media relations, who they want to pitch, what types of stories they want to get out there, what types of hidden stories exist within the institution, or hidden superstars that they want to really make sure are going to be covered perhaps in the future. And maybe the university or maybe the academic institution, or even if you work for a company, maybe the organization, whatever it is, has just won a big grant, or is establishing a new international center, or is creating a new degree program that focuses on artificial intelligence, for example. All of those things are going to be part of the strategic plan for media relations. I noticed this week that MIT announced that they're going to be creating, I believe, a new college of artificial intelligence. And I believe, if I'm correct, I believe that I read that they're going to invest, or they're going to have invested into it, $1 billion with a B dollars, $1 billion into this new college of artificial intelligence at MIT. And so you and I know for sure that the PIOs at MIT were in collaboration way in the past with the team that was putting that college together, because they were putting their media relations strategy together as they were putting that plan together to bring this idea to fruition. PIOs also help, in addition to planning things well in advance, right, and looking for the hidden stories that they can pitch on their own timeline, they are also responding quickly to breaking news and opportunities when breaking news comes in. So, for example, like with the Nobel Prize announcements that happened just last week, the idea is that as the Nobel Prize is being announced, if there's somebody at our university or at our research institution or even within our company that does work that's related to the Nobel Prize, then we would put out a press release, or we would call media and say, if you want to have this is the PIO speaking, if you want to interview a source who can talk about why this Nobel Prize is so interesting and who is familiar with this topic, I have an expert, I have a source that you can speak with. And this actually happened, I was actually witness to this very specific thing back in 1996, so in the last century. So in the last century, in 96, I was working as the student assistant to the director of communications for the physics department at the University of Arizona. So I was in my senior year, just about to graduate. And that October, of course, in 96, they announced the Nobel Prize in Chemistry, and it was given to 3 leaders for buckyballs, right, for carbon-60, for the discovery of the carbon-60 molecule, which now, as you know, is just throughout so many different areas and fields and industries and sectors. And at the University of Arizona, we have a professor named Dr. Donald Huffman, who was also an expert in C60 and in buckyballs. In fact, he, if I recall correctly, he was one of the first to create it on the Earth, him and his colleague. And so when the Nobel Prize was announced, my boss, the director of communications at that time, she jumped into quick mode. I mean, what she did was just truly amazing. Seeing that the Nobel Prize was announced that morning about buckyballs, and Dr. Don Huffman was an expert in buckyballs, she immediately went upstairs, talked to him, interviewed him, got a few quick phrases and quotes from him, and she put together a press release and then started calling media and sending this press release out to media. And what ended up happening was quite a few publications ended up covering the University of Arizona, the physics department, Dr. Don Huffman, and his contributions to the field of C60 and to the issues associated with discovering and actually building or constructing it, I should say, in a laboratory. And it was quick. She had to move very, very fast. She had to move with a laser focus. And Don Huffman had to be on board, and he was absolutely on board. He was absolutely very, very helpful in that. And we ended up at the department, and the university ended up getting a lot of press, particularly local press. So this is a tip for you. I want you to be thinking about this in terms of thinking about press. International press is fantastic. National press is fantastic. But a lot of scientists think, oh, I'm not going to bother telling my local newspaper or my local TV channels or my local podcast or any other local media that's in the location, the geographic location where I'm physically am, because that doesn't matter. And I would say, actually, that's not true, because it's all on the internet now anyway, so everybody can see that you were covered. Everybody can see that you were featured. And so these stories, a lot of the stories that went out about Dr. Huffman and his creating of C60 molecules in the laboratory, he that was covered by local press, which then was shared by national press. So there was a double influence going on there, even if the national press didn't, some of the national press didn't pick it up immediately. And so what I would recommend is that you think also local. Think, aim for national, aim for international, aim for intergalactic media. I appreciate that, and I always love when people are thinking big, but don't forget the local media, particularly when there's breaking news. The local media often needs and absolutely loves a local angle to international and national breaking news. And you could potentially be that source by working with your PIO. So that was something that I saw with my predecessor, and how she was able to do that so quickly. And so in addition to that, the PIOs and the PR pros within institutions, they also write and edit institutional publications. And these institutional publications, they could be research magazines, alumni magazines, they could be reports, the state of the department, the state of the college, the state of the university. But I got to tell you, as a journalist, I have gotten such good ideas, story ideas, that have been printed from institutional publications. So another reason for you to align and to build that relationship with your PIO is so that they can write articles about you in their institutional publications, which are then sent out to journalists like me looking for stories. And I'll give you some examples of that in a bit, but I just wanted you to sort of just think about that also. And the final thing that PIOs and PR pros do for institutions as it relates to you as a scientist or an engineer in that institution, and this is actually the most important. Interestingly, as they serve as a liaison between you and the media, as they're trying to get press for you and heighten your reputation and amplify your brand on the planet, what they can do also is help scientists to better communicate and prepare for media interviews. And this is especially important as it relates to cutting and potentially translating your scientific jargon, your technical jargon and technical language into language that the media and related their audiences and their readerships can relate to, right? So the way you communicate in a scientific paper is very different than the way you communicate with the press, with reporters. And I can tell you, as a reporter interviewing sources from across the scientific spectrum, because I've interviewed life scientists, material scientists, engineers, mechanical engineers, chemical engineers, pharmacologists, toxicologists, you name it, I've interviewed them, all different areas. And one thing I've noticed is that the ones who the ones who end up in the articles that I write about, the ones who are featured in the articles that I write about, have a very good handle and are very skilled at communicating with me the value, the essence, the kernel of their work without using the jargon of their community, right? Without using the language of their community. In other words, they talk to me as if I'm not necessarily an expert, because honestly, the stuff that I'm writing for the publications that I'm writing for, they're not technical experts. They may be enthusiasts. A great example of that is Scientific American. That magazine, their readership are highly, highly, highly educated and extremely interested in science. They are science enthusiasts listening to reading those articles, but they are not necessarily scientists themselves. And if they're writing an article about AI, they're not necessarily going to have a readership that understands the intricacies of the computer algorithms that are needed to be developed to develop an efficient AI system. So you can't talk in that language. You have to talk in a different language. But I have interviewed scientists and engineers who don't understand that and have not worked with their PIOs to better communicate and better learn how to communicate the value of what they're working on to a journalist. And as a result, I don't understand what they're saying. They're using so much jargon. They're talking to me as if I am an AI expert or a material scientist. They're using equations to describe, honestly, to describe their work. This means nothing to me as a non-expert, as a journalist, and it certainly is going to mean nothing to my audience. And so what PIOs can do is they can actually engage in training and preparation assistance with you to help you feel more comfortable interviewing with a journalist and help you feel more comfortable in how to translate the jargon and the technical language into language that a journalist will understand and will want and be able to write about in their publication, whatever publication it is. So it's just something to think about. Now, I want to talk to you about how I actually find stories, where these stories come from, and where the sources come from. And at the very top, it really does come from relationships I, as a journalist, have with scientists and engineers and mathematicians and technologists and other professionals. And it comes with my relationships with PR pros and PIOs. There have been times, in fact, for example, just within the last year, where I have connected with a PIO or a PR pro, and I come back to them multiple times from multiple publications to write about their client or their institutional employees for many, many different publications with many different angles, because of the relationship, because the relationship is so helpful and healthy, and they have been so gracious and supportive of what I need and responsive to my questions. They've been able to give me good sources. The sources have been very helpful and responsive and gracious with their time and with their ideas and information. They've given me true story ideas as opposed to this is a product, this is a paper that was published. They've told me what the story could actually be, and that's those relationships are invaluable to me, because that is the number one source that I use to find sources, to find stories, to publish articles. For example, so one of the resources, and I want to tell you about this because it's useful for you to just be aware of these resources that exist online. So there are a number of resources that exist that essentially help journalists find sources for stories. So they are essentially email chains, and they've now expanded into Twitter and other social media. And one of them is called Help a Reporter Out, HARO, HARO, Help a Reporter Out. Another one is called ProfNet, PROF as in Frank, ProfNet, like professional net, ProfNet. And both of those, what happens is if I'm writing an article, so I write a lot of articles for Science Magazine where I need multiple sources from multiple countries, from multiple organizations and institutions. So I will often go onto Help a Reporter Out and .com and profnet.com, and I will post on those web pages what I'm looking for, that I'm writing an article about artificial intelligence and careers in artificial intelligence, and I'm looking for sources in institutions like X, Y, and Z who could talk about career trends and issues. And I would like, sources from these parts of the world or these types of sectors, and so on and so forth. So when I do that, that is then transmitted to PR professionals, PIOs, and even professionals like yourselves, scientists and engineers. You can actually find out about that, so that and your PIO will know about these too, so that when requests come in, you can be kept apprised and you could potentially respond, or at least your PIO could respond on your part. So what happened was about 2 years ago, I think, I had put out a HARO, Help a Reporter Out announcement for an article that I was working on. And a public relations agency, a member of a public relations agency, responded, and she gave me a good source for that interview, for that article. And because she was so helpful, I said, well, why don't we have a meeting and let me talk to you a little bit about what I'm looking for other articles. And I think she even said also at the same time, are you working on any other articles? And I was more than happy, as a journalist, always looking for sources, always looking for help. I was more than happy to connect with her and have a conversation. So we sat down and had a phone call, and she invited a couple of her other colleagues on the line. And I told her about what I'm interested in writing about, who I write for, what topics I like to write about. And, for those of you who know me, I like to write a lot about career issues in STEM and profiles of amazing STEM superheroes, especially those who've gone into unusual careers. And so we started brainstorming, and as I was telling her, I was saying, what about if we did something like this? Could we do something like that? And I was asking her questions about her client. What are the expertise areas of your client? So that I could understand and get ideas for articles that I could potentially write. And that conversation led to a few more, and it led to multiple articles. So I ended up writing 2 or 3 or 4, I don't even remember, well, it was more than 2, and I think it was about 4 or 5 articles featuring her client over the course of the following year and a half, including a feature article in Physics World magazine, where it was a feature article about 3M, the company 3M, and you know 3M, they make Post-it notes, but they actually are a multi-billion-dollar multinational material science and engineering company. Their work touches almost every sector, from transportation to construction to infrastructure to manufacturing to personal care. And so I ended up writing an article about the physics of adhesives with a focus on what 3M does in the adhesives business, the glue, the physics of the glue that they create. And it was a feature article in Physics World magazine. And so that was the culmination of our building of our relationship. And our relationship is not over. That was just one output that we had. But that was a really great example of me collaborating and them collaborating with me, and both of us seeing it as a win-win to invest time into thinking about how we could help each other out. And as a result, I was able to write articles about 3M in a couple of different publications over the course of the last year and a half. So I think they were pretty happy about that. Another article that I wrote about somebody at 3M was in Science Magazine. So and then I just quoted that same source in another article for Science Magazine. So that relationship with the source was also vital for me, because if the source was being a jerk, if the source was not giving me good information, helping me to really understand what the story could be, then quite frankly, I wouldn't necessarily want to feature them or write about them or interview them again. But in this case, that wasn't the case. The source and their PR rep were both very, very classy and professional and helpful and responsive, and therefore they ended up getting quite a bit of press. So that was one place that I find stories. And then, you know what, your associations, your professional associations that you're a member of for your profession and for your field, they all have PR pros that work for those associations. And so I often will contact associations to ask for assistance with stories. So for example, recently, when I was writing that story about careers in AI, I contacted I think it's called the American Association for Artificial Intelligence, the AAAI, and I asked their PR director if she could help me find sources who are in AI research. And she did. She sent me a list of like 10 sources that I used for my article. So helpful. So to be able to stay connected with the PR director of your association is very useful. And I mentioned the institutional research magazines. Well, you know what? I am on the mailing list for the University of Arkansas Research Magazine. And they sent me a magazine about 2 or 3 years ago with a cover story about a cave physicist. That's a thing. Who knew it? I had no idea that existed. A cave physicist, and who works for the geology department at the University of Arkansas. And I write about physicists, and I was like, that is awesome. And also, what is a cave physicist? And I ended up reaching out to the PR director, the one who wrote that article, and they connected me with the cave physicist, and I wrote an entire article about that cave physicist. Similarly, I've attended conference presentations where I've gotten ideas for articles. So locally in Tucson, Arizona, in the US where I live, I saw a note in the local newspaper one day that said there was going to be a meeting in Tucson of the American Tarantula Association in Tucson. And I thought, and it was open to the public. So I was like, well, that sounds interesting. Why don't I go there and look to see if I can find some interesting stories? And lo and behold, a graduate student who is a forensic entomologist was giving a talk about forensic entomology. And again, I had no idea what that was, but I sat down with her afterwards to find out what it was, and I ended up writing an article about her for Scientific American online. And that came from that conference presentation. And by the way, forensic entomology is using bugs and using our understanding of entomology to better understand, for example, if a body dies, what's the post-mortem interval? So when did that body die? And bugs actually tell quite a story, the succession of insects in the body. I don't want to gross you out too much, but it's a very interesting story. And here was a young scientist on the verge of making a really, well, in fact, she did make an incredible discovery in this field and actually upended it because of her knowledge. So that was a great story. And I want to mention the story. The story was not just forensic entomology. The story was here was an early career scientist who had a great interest in forensics, having had a family member who was in the police service, and also had a great interest in science and wanted to find a way to marry those two areas. And because she loved insects and because she loved entomology so much, she began to think about what could she do as an entomologist to contribute to law enforcement. And she realized that forensic entomology would be the way, because she'd be working with law enforcement and helping them to understand the nature of a crime scene by use of bugs, by use of understanding how bugs interact in a crime scene. It's actually very interesting. So the story was her. It wasn't forensic entomology. The story was her. And related to that, one day there was a hurricane a few years ago in the US, and I was watching the national media, it might have even been CNN, and there was an announcement, not an announcement, but there was an interview on the TV with somebody, and his title said forensic meteorologist. And I was like, what in the heck is a forensic meteorologist? But I looked him up on LinkedIn. I found him online and found him, and I emailed him and I interviewed him, and I also wrote about him for Scientific American. And that's using meteorology to better understand crime scenes, or if you walk past my house and you slip and fall because there's ice in front of my house, you sue me because I didn't clean up the ice in front of my house. I might, or you might, call the forensic meteorologist to identify what were the weather patterns that day in that area. Was there actually ice at that time? Could there have been ice at that time? And that's the kind of thing that the forensic meteorologist does. And I also find stories from social media posts, from talking to people on airplanes. Bottom line, stories are everywhere. They really are. And speaking of stories, hey, Christoph, do we have a question or a story for me at this point?
Yes, thank you, Alaina. We actually have a comment that goes in the direction that sometimes is institutionally difficult to get your story out there. Someone just asked the question or made the comment that sometimes the public or private sector wants to have clearance before in writing before allowing someone to communicate their story or their research. And also often for some scientists, patent or trademark laws are in the way of easily communicating their stories to the general public because of non-disclosure rules or patent or trademark rules. Do you have a comment or an advice or a story about that difficulty of getting your story out there when
Yes.
describing your science?
And yes, and that's a great question, very, very vital question. And I appreciate the person who asked that. So that is absolutely an issue. So let me just cut to the spoiler alert here. If you work for a company, and even sometimes at a research institution, certainly a research lab, the reality is the stuff that you're going to be doing is going to be trade secrets. It's going to be things that you can't talk about, right? You're not necessarily going to be able to talk about numbers. You're not going to be able to talk about, how many items we shipped or the nature of the specific research, because it's protected under the veil of the corporate rules. And so you're employed by that organization, so you have to follow those rules. But to follow those rules, you have to understand what those rules are. So I would clarify with your boss and with your media relations people, what is it that you're allowed to speak about? Because you are going to probably still go to conferences, maybe even present at those conferences. You'll certainly be still out in the world, and we might end up on an airplane together, and I might be asking you, what do you do? How do you make it? Oh, how did you figure this out? Or what is the basis of this research? You need to know what you are allowed to speak about and what you're not allowed to speak about to the public and to the media. So having those frank conversations with your boss and perhaps with the media relations team in your institution, in your organization, is going to be a key thing that you should do. Now, with the idea that you still think that there's validity and relevance to getting the information out about the work that you do, it might also be useful to have a brainstorming meeting with your boss and with the media relations people to discuss what we could speak about, because I think, if this is you speaking, I think that the work that we're doing here is very interesting and would be of interest to different media. And I know certain journalists, like from reading, you would know certain journalists that might be covering stories that are related to the work that you're doing. And here's a great example. The Wall Street Journal is going to start a new section devoted to, or a subsection devoted to, artificial intelligence. And in fact, they just announced that they're hiring a reporter and an editor to focus exclusively on AI and its proliferance throughout all sectors and all fields around the world. So knowing this and getting to know who the journalist or maybe even the editor is, and let's say you work in AI, in the AI division of your corporation or your research lab, to have a conversation with your boss and your PR director or your PIO and say, I see that that Alaina is writing now for the Wall Street Journal, doing working on AI. I think there might be some interesting stories that we could pitch to the Wall Street Journal, and I wanted to see if you were interested in doing this and if we could think about how we could do this so that we're not releasing any secret information or private information that is vital to our company's function, but at the same time are amplifying our company's reputation and amplifying the work that we're doing in this space. So I think having those conversations are going to be really, really useful. And it's going to depend on your comfort level. So it might not be something you do 10 minutes after you're hired, because you have to produce, obviously, but it could be something that you do have a conversation with your boss about, at least maybe after a year, to talk about how we could really start to get this word out to organizations. But I will tell you that as a journalist, there are many times when I'm talking to a corporate researcher or a researcher who works for a government lab, and I ask them a question and they are not allowed to answer it. And they say, unfortunately, we're not allowed to give you that information. And so, I have to respect that. As a journalist, I have to respect that they're not able to give me the numbers or the details. Or, for example, when I've interviewed 3M, they're not allowed to give me the names of their clients, their customers. And I get that. I understand that, because that would potentially derail their relationships with those customers. So I'm not going to push them. That's not the type of journalism that I'm doing. I'm not an investigative journalist. I'm a different type of journalist. So I'm fine with them being honest with me, and I will respect those boundaries. So I think bottom line, have that conversation with your boss and then bring in the media relations person to have a more of an open discussion about it. Christoph, do we have another question at this point?
Yes, we have maybe one more question moving forward. Now, assuming that you have just made an amazing discovery or even a minor discovery, but that is very, very vital to your field, also to humanity, and that's about to be published as a paper, how do I best go at getting press for that? How do I best get my publication of my paper and my findings out there?
Good question.
Really,
Yeah, that's a great question. And I almost guarantee that we have, of all the attendees that are listening, of all the tens of thousands of attendees that are listening right now, right, of course, that almost everybody has that exact same thought in their head, that I'm about to publish a paper or we have this exciting discovery. How do we get press? So I am going to go a little bit more into detail about that in a moment, but let me just give you a little bit of an overview on that. So if you want to get press for your paper and your discovery, two things to keep in mind. Number one, timing. So as a journalist and also for your PIOs in your institution, give us and give them time to think about the paper, think about the discovery, to write the press release, to contact the journalist. They give me time as a journalist to think about the discovery, to potentially research it, to report on it and write and interview you. Don't tell me the day it's published that it's going to come out. Don't tell me that the day before it's published, this is an interesting story, we thought you'd be interested in it. I personally like at least about 2 weeks. Now, there is something called an embargo, and I wanted to talk about it later, but since it's related to this conversation, I'm going to mention it now. So an embargo is often put on by certain publications. So when you publish your paper, publication X or journal X, let's use that as our title, journal X will institute an embargo. So what that means is that the journal oftentimes has its own PR people. They will work with the authors of those papers, of the paper, and they will institute an embargo to me as a journalist. So they will tell me a few weeks beforehand that this paper is coming out. They might even give me access to read the paper. They might give me access to you, the author, so I can interview you. But I cannot publish or talk about the paper and the results until the embargo is lifted. And oftentimes the lifting, so it's essentially it bars me from publishing this paper until it's fine until a certain date. And often the reason that publications, journals do that is because they want to get as much press as possible. So they're actually interacting with multiple reporters at multiple publications around the world, and they want to have it all published on one day, and they don't want to potentially give or seem to give advance notice to one publication over another. So now what's stopping me from still publishing, right? What could I, why they give me the access, they give me the possibility of interviewing you. What's stopping me from still publishing before the embargo is lifted? It's professional courtesy and professional guidelines. Honestly, if I violated an embargo, I could potentially be blackballed and I might not be able to write about these papers or get access to these papers in advance again. And also it would damage my reputation. So it's very much a social contract that is in place. But I mention the embargoes because that's associated with the timing of how you would get press for your paper, is to see if there is an embargo for your paper and then work with the PIO at your institution and also the PR people at the journal, if there is one, to figure that out. Now, to figure out when you should be starting to talk to journalists, but at least for me, I like to have at least 2 weeks to write a paper, to write an article. Now, the other issue about getting press for your paper is the story. What's the story? So it's not enough to say that we have this, we discovered this, or we have this new data. I need to know why that data is relevant for my readership. If I'm writing an article for Scientific American or National Geographic or IEEE Spectrum, which is a high-tech technology magazine, engineering magazine, why is this going to be of interest to that readership? So if you just discovered, that in this particular experiment that this material could be used for, for surgery to reduce bleeding in a surgery, that you could use this material in some way, that is of relevance to my readership, right? Because everybody has somebody who's been sick, who's had a surgery, who bleeds, right? Most humans bleed. So that is going to be useful. If you can make the leap between your discovery and something that would be useful for the public, that's going to be the story. That's the story. It's not just the discovery, it's the leap that you have to make. So you need to be thinking about, why is this relevant and of interest to the public? A discovery of a material or a material's efficacy or efficiency or stability is not relevant, but the relationship between that material and improving surgery odds and health outcomes is absolutely relevant to the public. So look to make that leap. Great question. And I know, Christoph, we have more questions that are coming up that we have already lined up, right?
We do. We have a lot of questions that are coming up.
Okay.
And just looking at the time, we have another question break coming up. So
Okay.
we can maybe move on a little bit and then get back to a couple of questions later on.
That sounds like a
Because I
great
think,
idea.
all right.
Let's do that. Okay, so hold on to your questions, folks. We're going to answer them. So I want to give you some tips for effectively working with the media. And so, like I've said, we want to definitely build that relationship and think long term. Yes, it's good to have the media, the press now for your event or your experience or your discovery now, but also think long term and what value you can provide. Because like I said, the relationships that I've built with sources and PR directors and PIOs, the ones that I've built over time, I keep coming back to them for story ideas, and they keep getting press. Get to know me. Don't just pitch me an article about a new drug. I don't usually write about drugs. I really don't. What I usually write about, as I mentioned, are careers. So get to know what I write about. And you know what? Recently, somebody pitched me out of the blue. They sent me a cold email and they said, we represent company X, and we have a really extraordinary story of a scientist who transitioned from field Y to field Z, and now is the CTO of this company and works on solutions to do this. That's a story. And even though I didn't have a relationship with them prior, that perked my ears up. They were watching and they were reading carefully what I write about, and they pitched me appropriately. And they pitched me for what publications I write for, which was really, really important too. So when you get to know me, get to know not only what I write about and who I write for, but also get to know what my communication preferences are. So being 43, almost 44 and fabulous, I do text. Okay, I am in the 21st century and I do WhatsApp, but I don't usually start my relationships with that. I start my relationships with emails or sometimes LinkedIn messages. And I'm getting into Facebook messages too for the first contact. But, I know for other people who are earlier in their career and younger than me, the idea of reaching out to somebody for the first time via text is totally appropriate. But you should get to know what it is that I find appropriate and use that. And then know my working style. Know that I like to have about 2 weeks and that I do like to have phone calls with different people who are stakeholders in the subject. And how I like to be pitched. And then show me the story, right? I need people. I need a narrative. I need characters. I need a conflict, hopefully, even a conflict that a conflict could be, what caused this person to choose this path, or what conflict that caused this person to keep going in the face of challenges or lessons. A few years ago, I wrote an article about Danny Schuckman, who was a Nobel laureate 2011 in chemistry for the quasicrystals. And in the article I wrote, and he of course comes to Lindau quite a bit, and he openly talks about this, how when he made his monumental discovery and realized that it was something new, something novel, and he went down the hall to tell his boss was very rude to him and I think threw him out, and I think he even fired him. And so he fired a future Nobel laureate, told him to get out of the building. He had to find a new advisor at that institution or a new mentor. And that's conflict. That's a certain element, because Danny didn't give up. He just kept going and going and going, even in the face of public ridicule. There was another Nobel laureate who was publicly stating for years that Schuckman's work was erroneous, was faulty, was bogus. And Danny just continued on. He just continued on. And that is conflict. That is a story of a human. That's a story. That's a narrative. There's a lesson there that in terms of keeping going in the face of challenges. That's the kind of thing that I want. That's the kind of thing that I'm looking for. So that's really very useful. And what I also need in when I'm thinking about a story is I need visuals, and they could be physical visuals like the actual photographs and videos and things of that nature, but I also need narrative visuals. So for example, I wrote an article for Smithsonian Online a few years ago about an astronomer who he was beginning to start, he designs at the University of Arizona, he designs these huge mirrors that are used in telescopes around the world. And I mean the really big mirrors. And he developed the process to do this. And now the U of A, the University of Arizona, has the world's significant mirror laboratory. It's the place where most mirrors for most observatories are cast. And he was the founder of that. And he decided later in his life that he wanted to turn his attention to social entrepreneurship and use his expertise in mirrors to develop better solar systems, so solar energy systems. And he was motivated to do this because he lives in an area of Arizona which has a river, and over time he saw that river begin to disappear. So that is an example of a visual that I wove into the narrative. So I actually started the article and ended the article with that image of the river. That helped to actually set the stage of what was motivating this scientist to do this type of work. So that's the kind of visual that I need. be an essential resource for me. Show me that whether you're a source or not, now and later, show me that you're there to help me with my work, and make it easy for me to work with you. Give me the what, when, where, why, and how of what you're doing, and get back to me quickly. And then certainly understand and learn the rules of journalism. So we talked about the embargo. Some people ask me, can I see my quotes? Can I read the article before it's published? And quite frankly, most major publications have a rule against those things. So if you ask me to see the article, chances are I'm not going to be able to show it to you, and I'll tell you that. If you ask me to see your quotes, chances are I'm not going to be able to show those to you, and I'll tell you that. There are certain fact checks that I can do, and they're usually by phone. And there's also the issue of conflict of interest. So, if you offer me a trip to your plant or your university or your company to take a look at the company and maybe write an article about the company, that's great. But if you're going to pay for that, the chances are I'm not going to be able to write about it after that, because you've now inserted money into the equation. And even if I know personally that I'm not going to have a conflict of interest, the appearance of a conflict of interest exists now, and my publication will be very concerned about that, and they will nix the story. So just be aware of that. And also be aware that everything's on the record with a journalist. So if I'm interviewing you, if we're having a conversation, even a casual conversation, it's on the record, unless we specify in advance that it's not. So I could potentially quote you. I'm not into gotcha journalism, and I tell my sources that I want you to be comfortable with what you're saying to me, but the reality is, with other journalists, the work that we do, we are listening at every given point. So just be aware of that. And we talked a little bit about the timing issue. So timing is everything. Give me time to prepare, and don't tell me about the event, the paper, or whatever it is after the fact, because after is not necessarily news. Now, I know we're running a little bit behind schedule, so I'm going to hold off on the other questions until the end, which is we're just about at the end anyway. So I also wanted to just give you some ideas about how to network with the media at conferences. And I've done this myself when I was doing public relations. You can even do this as a scientist. You could ask if you could hang out in the press room. I remember at the press room at the American Physical Society many, many years ago, I was hanging out in the press room. I was the communications director. I was hanging out there. There were journalists, there were editors, there were PR directors, PIOs, and there were physicists in the room. And the physicists were getting access to those journalists. So it's a very good opportunity for networking, as are the press conferences and the press events and mixers. You could ask if you could attend those too. And let your association PR director know that you're happy to answer any media inquiries. Your institution, as I mentioned, could connect you with media, even your local media relations community. And don't be afraid to send cold emails to members of the media, and even the National Association of Science Writers, the World Congress of Science Journalists, the organization of science journalists and science writers in your community. They could potentially be a source for you to connect with as well. And finally, in talking about social media, if I'm going to potentially leverage you as a source and interview you for an article, make it easy on your social media for me to understand what your expertise is. So on your Twitter feed, say material scientists with an expertise in X and Y. On your LinkedIn profile, your headline should be material scientists with an expertise in X and Y. List out what you know about, because I will be searching those sites. I'll be searching Twitter, and I will be searching LinkedIn to find sources to interview them. And so you could also connect with me on social media. You can connect with me on LinkedIn. You can connect with me on Twitter and get to know my beats, my subject areas. And if I put out a call for sources, and I do this a lot on Twitter and LinkedIn, please respond. I want to hear from you. In fact, here's a fun heads up. I am going to be announcing a need for sources within the next couple of days on LinkedIn. So if you're connected to me on LinkedIn, you'll be able to know that I'm announcing that need for sources, and you could potentially respond. And then, of course, promote your achievements, because the more achievements that I, as your journalist colleague, knows, the more I get a sense of what your credentials are, the more I would think of you as a source, and recognize that the social media with the media goes both ways. So you can tweet at me and I will tweet at you. So in conclusion, as a journalist, I am always on the hunt for good, novel, exciting, fun, interesting stories that are about people doing amazing things that demonstrate the humanity behind science, engineering, and everything else. So think stories, think narrative, think the connection between your work and the rest of the world. I welcome the chance to partner with you, but be mindful of journalism issues associated with timing, conflict of interest, publication requirements, and be a resource. And I guarantee I will keep coming back to you, with you, for you, to write about you multiple times. You know about Lindau for Life. I want you to think about leveraging your Lindau Alumni Network always. This is also a way that you could potentially get press. You know, interestingly, connecting with Lindau and making sure Lindau knows about your continued achievements as an alum. They put out announcements too. They put out a lot of social media. I'm paying attention to that. I'm getting ideas for stories just from that as a source. So let Lindau know what they can do to help you to advance your career as an alum. Keep that networking going. Pay it forward and promote Lindau at your institution and community, because this is all a huge return on the investment that you're going to be giving and getting. So it's a really exciting time to be a Lindau alum. With that, I want to thank you so much. This was, as usual, quite a privilege and a pleasure and an honor to work with you. And I want to thank, of course, the Lindau Nobel Laureate Meetings for their kind support of these types of endeavors. You guys are amazing. I can't wait to see you in the press. And Christoph, do we have any other questions that I can answer for today?
Yes, Elena, thank you. We do have 3 really great questions that we really need to discuss as well. And I really want to iterate as well that we're really happy to help our Lindau alumni get press for their stories and their research that they want. And we're happy to share. If you just send me a heads up note that you're about to publish something, or also that you'll about to embark on a new endeavor, then I'm happy to share that. Also, share it in our alumni network, and we'll put it on all our channels. And also, if you have different projects, we're happy to share that for you as well. But now I really want to get to these last couple of questions. And we have 2 questions that kind of go in the direction of rules you need to follow or maybe overcome. One great question is on the difference between journalist jargon and a scientific one. And do journalists prefer scientists to use really simple language, or is it also okay to use specific scientific terms if they're necessary? But what is more important, the easy language or to be specific? The example that Eva, our alumna, gave is if you work in the process of ubiquitination, would it be okay to use that word, or to just describe it as more of sort of a kind of protein modification which is involved in et cetera, without using the specific scientific term?
Excellent question. Thank you for asking that. And also thank you for giving that specific example. So I like that example because as a journalist, I have no idea what that is. So this kind of answers your question. And this is actually how you do it. What you can do is you can ask the journalist what their background is. You can ask the journalist what is their knowledge about protein structures, or their background associated with the overall field that you're thinking of. And they could then at that point say, oh, I am aware of how proteins, work and how they fold together. I have expertise in that. And then at that point, you could give them the item. You could give them that specific term, and you could potentially even define it for them if they weren't. You could say, I don't know if you're familiar with this term, but it means this and this. So you can go back and forth with the journalist to ask them, what is their level of knowledge. But I would say this: don't presume that I, as a journalist, know the jargon. And what I usually do when I start a conversation with a source is I will often ask them, explain to me your work as if I don't have a background in this, as if I just met you on the train. And I did that with the artificial intelligence professionals that I interviewed for that recent story. I think I interviewed about 10 or 15 people for that story. And for each one of them, they are all PhDs in physics and material science and data science and neuroscience. And they are all working at the forefront, and computer science, and they're all working at the forefront of AI. So the way they communicate about AI in their lab to each other, to other AI researchers, is very different than what they would communicate to me. And also what my readers would understand. So I asked them at the beginning, could you tell me what is the significance of AI today? Can you explain to me what AI is and what AI does? for somebody who does not have a background in computer science. And I must say that almost everybody, if not everybody that I interviewed, was able to explain AI just very, very simply, that it's teaching computers to do things that humans can't do, or to teach computers to do things more efficiently than what humans can do. That is the basic definition of what AI is. Then we got into some more, details. As I asked them questions about, like, for example, the computing languages they use or how they develop the algorithms, they would share with me information about that. And then I might say, oh, could you explain that to me? Because that, I don't know. I'm not familiar with that term. I'm not familiar with that. So you don't have to be afraid to use jargon with a journalist, but you should recognize that most journalists are not going to have the level of expertise, of technical expertise that you have. So you should be ready to share with them the high level view of in a non-technical way of what you do, so that they understand it. And then you could get into more technical jargon and more detail the more you get into the interview, and the more you understand not only what the journalist's background is, but also what the level of the background is of the audience. Thanks for asking that question.
Yeah, it was a really great question. I also think that it's important to stay specific even in your explanations. Now, the next question from Kale from Nigeria goes into a direction that was also hotly debated at the last meeting, and it's on scientific publication. And the question is, how can you get your publication out there in the media without violating the publisher's rules?
Right. Yeah, so that's a great question. Thanks for asking that. And they all the way from Nigeria, welcome. So this is the issue of the embargo. So this is what you need to do. You need to connect and talk to your editor at the journal to find out what their policies are. So you have to follow their policies. And if their policies say, that you can't talk about this until such and such a date, because it is under that embargo, or you are, you have to, or if there's other rules that they have in place, you need to know what they are. They will be able to tell you. And let's say they have a very strict rule, like you can't talk about it with they don't even want you to talk about it with your PIO for some reason until the journal publishes the paper. What you can do is you can talk to the editor at your editor at the journal, and perhaps also bring in, say maybe we should talk to the public relations manager of the journal, because most journals do have somebody who works on the communications and PR side. And I have ideas as to why this would be of interest to Scientific American, or interest to Science or Nature, or on the news side. And I want to see if we can develop a media relations strategy, or a way to connect with the media and without violating the policies of the journal. But I think this would be a way for the journal to get some publicity. And this would be the way you'd present it, by saying that the journal would get something out of it. This is the essence of what I talk about a lot, which is creating win-win alliances with the people that you collaborate with, whether it's for networking, or it's interviewing, or for public relations and journalism. So earlier in this workshop, I even said that we want to create a win-win. So to show your publication that you're thinking about how you can get publicity for the publication, that you're thinking about what you can do for them if they connect with a journalist or an editor or a publication to get press, that's a wise move on your part. And that's going to encourage them to be more proactive and more forward-thinking in deciding about getting publicity for your paper. Thanks so much for that.
Yes, thank you for the excellent question. We have one last that could almost be its own webinar or article series, and it's from Vaidi. Also asked the first excellent question, and it's on the difficult question of how do you measure up your economic impact of your communication measures, even if it's often a win-win situation. Ideally, putting a lot of effort into your communication is also takes up resources. So do you have advice on how you can measure the economic value of your communication efforts?
That's a great question, and Christoph, I see I see a webinar in our future or a blog in our future about this topic, about the economic measuring the economic relationship or the economic outputs of our work, of our communications efforts, of our scientific outputs, and so on and so forth. So whoever asked that question, thank you for giving us that idea. So, you know, in ancient days, in the 90s, in ancient days, we would actually measure the public relations economic value by the readership and the value of advertisements in that same magazine or that same publication. So if we were able to get you know, a full page article about your research at your university in Nigeria and your expertise in the field of material science, for example, full page article in that magazine, we would measure the economic output or the economic return on investment based on how much somebody would pay for a full page advertisement in that same publication, because it is all about eyeballs. It's all about who's seeing it and how many people are seeing it, and especially how many influencers are seeing it, people who make decisions and have the authority to make decisions on purchases, on investments, on policy decisions, leadership development, and so on and so forth. Now, these days, I think it's a little bit more nuanced than that, because there's so much, there's so many, it's just not measured in that way anymore. So I would say that the way, and I don't know exactly what the way public relations professionals use to measure the economic output, and I can actually look that up. I would be happy to look that up. So whoever asked that question, if you want to follow up with me personally with the email address on the screen, I'm happy to check on that for you. And Christoph, I can get back to you on that as well, so you can transmit it to the alumni. But what I would guess is the way to think about it is, every article that you get out there, every article in Science and Nature and Scientific American about your work, about your contribution, every time you're quoted in the media, you are solidifying your brand, your promise of value in the media. You are communicating that you are an authority in this field. You are transmitting the significance of this field and this industry and this research. And you are amplifying the reputation of the whole system, which includes you, your research, your field, your institution, even your region. And that is worth money in the bank, because you're able to disseminate information that might lead to product development. You're disseminating information which could help to change laws or inform laws that could support scientific funding. You're disseminating information to encourage people to go into this field. You're disseminating information to encourage investors to invest in this field, and particularly invest in you and invest in your research. So there is a trickle-down effect that does translate into an economic value and an economic return on that investment. I don't know what that specific number would be, but we could potentially look into that. But it's a great thing to be thinking of, and I really appreciate that you brought that up, because we should be thinking about what is the quantification of our success. We always want to quantify our success with numbers as much as possible. Great point. I'd like to look into it more for you.
Terrific. Well, thank you, Alaina, for the webinar. Thank you, everyone, for asking these terrific, difficult questions. And we will hopefully follow up on that. We can also discuss these topics in the Lindau Alumni Network. A recording of this video for the end of this webinar, if you want to go back to it, will be on our YouTube page probably sometime tomorrow afternoon, European time. And we will also put the link into the Lindau Alumni Network and also share it on our social media channels. And if you have any more questions or suggestions for either Alaina or us here in Lindau, then feel free to contact us at any time. And once again, thank you, Alaina, for this insightful webinar, and thanks everyone for tuning in.
Thank you, everybody.